This lecture is not an indictment. It is not a courtroom, and I am not here to assign guilt. What we are about to explore is far more unsettling and far more important. This is a lecture for those who are living right now, inside what I would call an invisible interrogation room, a space where no judge is seen, no law is written, and yet the verdict is always already decided. It is for those who have explained themselves once, twice, endlessly, yet remain under suspicion. For those who have quietly asked themselves, if I just try harder, will this finally be enough? And most critically, for those who have reached the most dangerous psychological threshold of all, the moment when you no longer trust your own perception of reality. Let us begin with a necessary clarification. What is often dismissed as jealousy is not, in fact, mere jealousy, nor is it reducible to temperament, insecurity, or a difficult personality. What we are confronting is a cognitive domination structure operating within a relationship. In a rational epistemology, suspicion functions as a hypothesis. It is provisional. It seeks verification. It remains open to falsification. But within this structure, suspicion undergoes a transformation. It ceases to be a hypothesis and becomes a conclusion. The verdict is reached first. The evidence is gathered afterward. And at that precise moment, the relationship ceases to be a space of dialogue. It becomes a site of judgment. Now, let us take a philosophical step back. In the ancient text known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, there is a striking instruction. Recognize that the forms you see are projections of your own mind. This is not merely a spiritual metaphor. It is a profound epistemological warning, because the structure we are analyzing begins exactly at the point where that warning is ignored. The moment an internal projection is granted, the status of external reality, something irreversible occurs. The relationship enters a cycle not of growth, but of repetition, a psychological samsara. In this state, suspicion no longer requires confirmation. Anxiety no longer requires reflection. Emotion is no longer examined, it is elevated to the status of truth. And within this system, one partner undergoes a subtle but devastating transformation. They become the one who explains, then the one who proves, and eventually the one who doubts themselves. Let me be absolutely clear. This lecture is not about fixing another person. It has three purposes only. First, to recognize the structure. Second, to exit the structure. Third, to ensure you never re-enter it. Because love, contrary to what many have been conditioned to believe, is not something that must be proven. Love is the condition in which both individuals become safe. So if you find yourself repeatedly asking, what more do I have to do to be believed? Then the question itself is already diagnostic. It is not a sign that you must try harder. It is evidence that trust has already collapsed. Today, we will not analyze emotions. Emotions are too easily manipulated within this system. Instead, we will analyze structure. And as we proceed, we arrive at the final stage of this dynamic, the point at which love itself is transformed into a test. Not a test of compatibility, not a test of growth, but a test of endurance. Here, a crucial inversion takes place. The question is no longer, do I trust you? It becomes, how much can you withstand? At this stage, suspicion is no longer an expression of anxiety. It becomes an instrument, a tool of measurement. And so the logic of the relationship shifts. Love is no longer shared. It is evaluated. How far can this person be pushed? How much pressure can they tolerate? Will they remain, even when confronted with the unreasonable? Under these conditions, love is no longer an experience. It becomes a stress test. And the methods of this testing are not random. They are systematic. There is deliberate withdrawal, sudden emotional coldness, unexplained silence. There are irrational demands rules that cannot be logically justified, yet must be obeyed. There is emotional provocation, engineered jealousy, calculated reactions. And finally, there is the ultimate threat, the withdrawal of the relationship itself. Maybe we should end this. You'd be fine without me, wouldn't you? Each of these is not an expression of vulnerability. It is a calibrated mechanism designed to answer a single question. Will you still choose me no matter what I do? And here lies the paradox. In such a system, passing the test is indistinguishable from failing it. If you fail, the conclusion is immediate. I knew you would leave. If you pass, the conclusion is equally immediate. I can push further next time. There is no terminal point, no final validation, because the test is not designed to discover truth. It is designed to expand control. At this juncture, it is useful to return once more to philosophical insight. In the same Tibetan text, it is said that after death, beings enter states shaped by attachment and fear. These states are described as forms of ignorance conditions that perpetuate the cycle of rebirth. If we translate this into psychological terms, the analogy becomes clear. What appears as a test of love is, in fact, an attempt to manage fear, not by resolving it, but by externalizing it. The partner is tested, but the real object being avoided is internal anxiety. In this sense, the test is not directed outward. It is an evasion of inward confrontation. Now we must confront the most difficult question. Can such a relationship be repaired at this stage? The answer, if we are to remain intellectually honest, is deeply uncomfortable. At this stage, repair is no longer the primary task. Exit is, because the system is no longer oriented toward mutual preservation. It is oriented toward the maintenance of control. Within such a structure, communication itself becomes compromised. Explanation becomes evidence. Dialogue becomes interrogation. And persuasion becomes just another phase of the test. So let us summarize with precision. The moment love becomes a test, trust is no longer the foundation of the relationship. And without trust, what remains is not love, but a controlled environment, a psychological laboratory. And in that laboratory, one person is no longer a partner. They are a subject. If you take nothing else from this lecture, take this. Love is not proven. Love is the condition in which proof is no longer required, and the capacity to endure suspicion is not a measure of love's depth. It is a measure of how far one has drifted from safety. In the next stage of our discussion, we will move from analysis to action. Not how to endure such a structure, but how to identify it, exit it, and recover from it with clarity and dignity. Because the ultimate goal is not to win the test. It is to refuse the premise entirely. At the end of our previous discussion, we arrived at a critical threshold, the moment when love is no longer experienced as safety, but as something that must be proven under pressure. Now, let us move into the second scene, because what happens next is not confined to two individuals in a relationship. It expands outward into family, into friendships, and ultimately into society itself. Observe the pattern carefully. Girlfriends stand with the woman. Male friends stand with the man. A mother stands with her daughter. A mother-in-law stands with her son. And the chorus begins. You're right. That's exactly what happened to you. There's something wrong with the other person. This is not your fault. Not at all. At first glance, these words feel like comfort. They sound like empathy. They resemble support. But let us be precise. This is not empathy. This is collective identification. It is the absorption of another person's emotional position. without distance, without analysis, and most importantly, without responsibility. From a philosophical standpoint, this distinction is crucial. Aristotle argued that ethical judgment requires three elements: context, distance, and accountability. Without context, judgment becomes shallow. Without distance, it becomes biased. Without accountability, it becomes dangerous. And yet, in these moments of support, all three are absent. Those who speak do not live inside the relationship. They do not bear the consequences of escalation, and often they unknowingly intensify the conflict. They say, "I'm on your side," but they do not marry in your place. They do not divorce in your place, and they certainly do not rebuild your life in your place. Now, let us return once more to a deeper philosophical lens. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, there's a striking idea about the most dangerous illusions encountered after death. It is not terrifying demons that pose the greatest threat. It is familiar faces, the voice of a mother, the anger of a friend, the moral certainty of family. These are not external truths. They are projections constructed by the mind, shaped by attachment and fear, appearing in forms we instinctively trust. And here is the critical danger. The moment you follow these projections without reflection, you stop thinking. Let us synthesize this clearly. What do authoritative TV experts, well-meaning friends, and loyal family members have in common in these situations? Their certainty is strong. Their structural understanding is weak. Their accountability is non-existent. They do not engage in thought. They deliver conclusions. And this leads us to a necessary correction. The greatest danger is not jealousy itself, not suspicion, not even control in its early forms. The greatest danger is a social environment that legitimizes anxiety as truth. Because once anxiety is validated without examination, it no longer appears as something to question. It becomes something to obey. Again, the ancient warning is precise. The moment you recognize an illusion as an illusion, it loses its power. But what happens when society does the opposite? When experts affirm it, when friends reinforce it, when family sanctifies it, then the suffering is no longer individual. It becomes collectively manufactured. At that point, the individual is no longer simply trapped in a relationship. They are embedded in a system. So let us restate the core insight of this lecture. What sustains pathological jealousy is not merely internal insecurity. It is the language, casual, confident, socially approved language, that converts anxiety into certainty without thought. Now, I want this lecture to serve a very specific function, not to provoke outrage, not to assign blame, but to create a moment of distance. A single step back from the illusion, because from that distance something becomes visible. We have already traced the full trajectory. Suspicion begins as a spark. It intensifies into anxiety. It hardens into control. And ultimately it is perfected as a system of testing. And that test, as we have established, has no endpoint, because there is no such thing as passing. Fail the test, and the conclusion is, "I knew you would leave." Pass the test, and the conclusion is, "Next time, I can push further." Within this structure, no response produces innocence. Every action is reinterpreted. Every explanation becomes evidence. Every silence becomes suspicion. And this is why the final stage is not merely the collapse of love. It is the collapse of reality judgment. The ability to distinguish between what is felt and what is true begins to erode. And it is precisely at this point that we move into the next phase of analysis. In our next lecture, we will examine how suspicion ceases to function as a hypothesis and becomes a conclusion, and how that conclusion systematically dismantles memory, emotion, and identity. The logic unfolds like this. Something feels off. If it feels off, there must be a reason. If there is a reason, my suspicion is justified. And if you reject my justified suspicion, you must be hiding something. Within this framework, emotion becomes the judge, not evidence, not reason, not reality. And here again, the most dangerous variable is not the individual alone. It is the collective endorsement of that logic. The confident declarations of media experts, the partisan reassurance of family, the emotionally charged validation of friends, strong conviction, no structural insight, zero responsibility. So I ask you once more to recall the ancient instruction. The moment you recognize the illusion as illusion, it loses its power. The purpose of this lecture is not to fight the illusion directly, but to allow you to see it as illusion, because that is where freedom begins. Let us end with clarity. Love is not the ability to test another person. It is the ability to become safe together. Enduring suspicion is not a measure of depth. Explaining yourself endlessly is not devotion. The beginning of recovery is simple, though not easy. To choose a relationship in which explanation is no longer required. In our next session, we will bring this entire framework to its final conclusion and leave you with a definitive warning that runs through everything we have discussed. Because the moment you fully understand this structure, you are no longer inside the interrogation room. You are standing outside of it. And from there, you can finally decide whether to walk away. If this lecture has helped you see even one layer more clearly, consider sharing it, because there are many people still living inside systems they cannot yet name. This is not a channel that amplifies emotion. It is a channel that dissects structure. And in the next lecture, we will complete that dissection.